Hello, folks, and welcome now to part three of our lecture on the first civilizations. Part three will focus mostly now on the great civilization of ancient Egypt, but also we'll take a look at the first great civilization of Southeast Asia or Southern Asia called Harappan civilization. But first, we start with Egypt, which has been described through history as the gift of the Nile River, which you see here in a colorized satellite photograph. The incredible, stark separation between the Nile River as it flows from the highlands of Tanzania to the south, flows directly on a northern axis now toward the Mediterranean Sea here, what we call Lower Egypt, before emptying out through this great delta region into the Mediterranean Sea. So the gift of the Nile suggests that from the very beginning, life and agriculture and civilization itself tightly connected to this artery of life known as the Nile River. And the annual rhythms of the Nile River, which brought life or the possibility of life to the people of the Nile River Valley. It was the annual floods that accompanied the movement of the Nile River across Africa. The annual floods, which were the Nile's greatest gift, you might say, because though in Mesopotamia flooding often offered the prospect of devastation and loss, it was the case in Egypt that the flooding was actually welcomed. The annual floods deposited the fertile soils along the riverbanks, making it possible for farmers to grow crops in what would otherwise be a desert environment. You can see here again the beauty of this picture is that the stark separation between the desert sands and the Nile's gift here of rich, fertile alluvial soils brought from the river bottom and deposited along the riverbanks through the process, the process of annual flooding. It was that river soil that allowed Egypt's farmers to live close to the river, to farm the soils for the crops they needed. And no wonder that the iconography of ancient Egypt, that is, the beautiful images that exist still to this day, often depict that very process of working and living along the banks of the Nile River. You know, we've seen the great technological innovation in Sumer of the plow pulled by the oxen. Well, here you see the Egyptian version of that as agriculture emerges in the Neolithic period. And colorfully depicted is this process with the teeming abundance of life itself, from the date palm trees to the crops that provided the bread, the cereal crops, the grain crops that provided the bread of ancient Egyptian life, and even for that matter, the barley that offered the gift, you might say, of brewed beer, going back several millennia now, these traditions into the Egyptian past. Now, it wasn't that Egypt enjoyed anything like regular rainfall, that we might here in California point to as the key, to our own hydration as a state. In Egypt, rainfall was scarce and created dependence instead on these regular cycles of Nile River flooding. The economy that came from the flooding of the Nile River was based on what one historian has called and everyday abundance, a plentiful diet of bread and beer, as I say, that was attuned to those regular rhythms, biannual rhythms of flooding, in which the waters of the Nile would overflow the banks, and in good years leave just the right amount of rich river soil for the farmers to begin farming. In not so good years, either flooding would be more sort of destructive of nearby settlements, or overrun the banks only too much and thus cause peril for the human inhabitants, but typically not the kind of peril, not the kind of wildly unpredictable rhythm that you see in Sumer, where odes to great floods and tragic and catastrophic floods became so much a part of the literature of early Mesopotamia. Here the literature tends to be a bit happier, a bit more optimistic. The floods were welcomed. And this photograph from modern Egypt shows you just how narrow that margin was. Here you see the waters of the Nile. Here you see the adjacent banks with the palm groves and the cattle grazing. But the floods would, of course, bring the water up over onto the banks, depositing, as I say, that alluvial soil. But just beyond that narrow margin, no more than maybe a half mile or mile, and not much more in many cases, beyond that you would see the stark, seemingly lifeless topography of the desert cliffs, the desert sands. So yes, a narrow ribbon of life, but a ribbon of life that for thousands of years now will support Egyptian civilization. This everyday abundance we talk about came from an active relationship with nature, and a highly specialized labor that learned to exploit the opportunities of the Nile River. Here again, we need to talk about ecology. We're talking about a relationship between human beings and the natural world they inhabit. Nothing about Egyptian civilization or any other civilization came particularly easy. It required terrific effort, constant labor, and I'm talking now the sweat of your brow, the muscles in your back, the wearing away of the skin of your fingers in the daily labors that civilization required, that agriculture required to be sustained. An ancient Egyptian tomb offering that celebrates everyday labor, particularly the making of the bread, is what this scene depicts. These exquisite little figurines carved from wood. They look a bit larger on your screen, but they would fit in the palm of your hand in terms of their actual size. And the scene that's depicted, the most ordinary of scenes, not great battles, not kings rising to thrones, but ordinary workers, daily laborers, given here the kind of respect that Egyptians long accorded the common man, if you will, because it was the labor of the common man and woman that supplied ultimately the sustenance of life for the Egyptian people. Beer and bread making, in fact, were regarded as nearly magical activities in the ecology of civilization. And again, in the words of Armesto, our historian, quote, turning barely edible grains into mind-expanding drinks and a life-sustaining food. So something almost miraculous about the process of converting grains and seeds into the staff of life, be it bread or beer or what have you. So a great reverence given to this process and to the labors on which it depended. Irrigation projects, among the many labors needed to take full advantage of the Nile River, irrigation projects turned desert sands into, quote, microclimates of everyday food production. Egyptians used irrigation to create orchards and gardens and to channel the life-giving waters of the Nile River into the places where they could best be exploited. And what we see from a very early period in Egypt, from the Neolithic period, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000 years ago, is what we would call today ecological diversity. That is combining the grain-rich lands of Upper Egypt with the lush, game-rich delta lands of Lower Egypt, combining the possibilities of ecology to create an abundance not only of everyday life, but very sort of specialized microclimates of everyday food production. The scene that you're looking at here from a 3,500-year-old tomb picture shows an irrigated garden. An irrigated garden with a diversity of plants and trees and edible things. You see up here in the corner the woman tending to the garden. In the middle, a kind of pond, if you will, teeming with aquatic life, fowl and fish that could likewise be harvested for human consumption. All in a very kind of colorful, charming display. Again, really free of the kind of almost pessimism we often see in the Mesopotamian depictions. As I've suggested, civilization was nothing if not a dramatic reshaping of nature by man, a re-engineering of nature by man. And again, from a satellite view, we can see the extraordinary nature of this ecology in Egypt. The black, from the satellite view, the seemingly black river of the Nile set against the earth tones, the desert tones, the sand of the Egyptian landscape. You know, the ancient name for Egypt, that is the name that ancient Egyptians themselves used to refer to their land, was Kemet. Kemet, and it translated as black land. Black land, and that was a reference to the soils, the river soils, the dark, rich, alluvial soils full of organic material that allowed the crops to grow and the farmers to sow the harvest, to sow the seed and to reap the harvest and to enjoy the bounty that it provided. So yeah, the black land. The name Egypt actually was coined by the Greeks much later because they erroneously thought, the Greeks did, that the people who founded Egyptian civilization were those they knew as gypsies. So they called it the land of the gypsies, Egypt. That was a mistake. The gypsies were not from Egypt, but so you have it, a misnamed land that has rendered a name we still use today. Now, if you played the hypothetical, if the Nile River dried up, the black soil would simply become sand. That alluvial soil would simply turn to dust, and no one would be able to live off its produce. In fact, as it is, the nitrogen content, the life-giving nitrogen content of that soil decreases by 2/3 between the floods. So even if one of the biannual floods didn't occur, then there would be a catastrophic loss. The soils would be left infertile, and people would not have an ability to feed themselves, or at least throughout ancient Egyptian history that was the case. But this is the kind of ecosystem, the seemingly delicate or finely tuned ecosystem that will create and support now one of the great civilizations of world history. Yes, Egypt, the gift of the Nile. The Nile River, one of the longest rivers in the world, over 4,000 miles long, starting in the highlands, as I say, of Central Africa and Tanzania, flowing northward down through the lower elevations toward the Great Egyptian Delta. Upper Egypt itself, the region geographers refer to Upper Egypt, 500 miles long and 5 miles wide. So that snaking ribbon-like lifeline known as the Nile, no more than 5 miles wide, and I mean not just the river itself, but the surrounding lands upon which people could live, no more than 5 miles wide. That yearly flooding we mentioned allowed for 3 harvests a year. 3 harvests a year could be netted by the Egyptian farmer, ensuring not enough not just enough food for his own family, but also ultimately enough food to support a civilization. But note, all that farming occurs on just 3% of Egypt's total land area. 3% of Egypt's total land area, the region tightly knitted to the Nile River itself, supported the civilizations for thousands of years that were brought as a result of this flooding rhythm. Another startling statistic, 99% of the Egyptian people historically have lived on just 1/30th of the available land area in Egypt. Again, that particular need being associated with proximity, closeness to the Nile River and its life-giving soils. So a remarkable ecology of civilization. Even the building of palaces, temples, and monuments, the sort of thing that makes Egypt so famous, even today, required a fundamental engagement and revision and re-engineering of the landscape. Here's an aerial view of the Giza Plateau, where the Nile River meets the delta, the scene and site of the great Egyptian pyramids, viewed from above. Such a landscape, as you can see, was going to require an enormous amount of labor invested in reshaping into what was a sort of nearly barren landscape into what we know is the great landscape of Egyptian civilization. From the Satire of the Trades, a 3,000-year-old ancient Egyptian text, comes the homage to the laborer, in this case the mason. I'll describe to you also the mason. His loins give him pain. Though he was out in the wind, he works without a cloak. His loincloth is a twisted rope and a string in the rear. This is a kind of semi-satirical, but also probably pretty factual ode or homage to the ancient Egyptian laborers, in this case the mason, the stone worker, who, like workers throughout time, suffered the aches and pains and creaky joints of the laborer, and none too comfortably established would be this person, working in the elements, the dry, the heat, the wind, the dust, with hardly anything but a simple cloak and a twist of rope as a loincloth. And it was yet these figures who, together over time, created the great scenes, the landscapes of the Nile River. And as you see, in some cases, though perhaps the clothing has changed, even the basic tools are reminiscent of, and the techniques reminiscent of, the ancient laborers who also quarried the rock and carved the stone. A picture here of a man standing on the shelf of one of the pyramids next to the uniformly carved and shaped great granite blocks that went into the making of the pyramid. So an extraordinary engagement with the land and its elements. And not surprisingly, an evolving vision of civilization over time that is still quite familiar to us today, although it might be worth a second look, because we wish often, I think, to shroud the great works of the ancient world in mystery. It's romance and mystery that sells magazines and books and TV shows and such, anything that has the allure of the forbidden or mysterious. But really history is a process of demystification. Our job is to not wrap things up in riddles, but to unwrap them, to understand them as fundamentally human processes. And so something even as grand as the Great Pyramids of Egypt reveal themselves to be works of human construction. One of the oldest of the large pyramids in Egypt shows the evolutionary nature of this engineering and construction marvel, a process of perfection, you might say, in remodeling the landscape. Scholars call this the step pyramid that you see above, for the simple fact that it was a series of boxes, one on top of the other, each smaller than the one before, eventually creating a kind of pyramidal structure. It was from that early beginning of experimenting, you might say, that the next great work, the so-called bent pyramid, revealed an evolving practice, a practice still imperfect. Heck, if aliens had flown from outer space to create these works, would they really have miscalculated here the degree and angle of the slope and the face as this architect did? You can see why it's called the bent pyramid. The initial slope was too severe. They recognized that it was going to be difficult to sustain, and so they changed the slope. Get my cursor back. They changed the slope and flattened it out a bit. That was not, it's thought to be the original intent, but instead a mid-construction change of plans as they began to better understand both the mathematics and engineering of working with these great materials on these enormous and monumental scales. Oh, sure, by the time we get to the Great Pyramids of Egypt, we're talking about the masterpiece, the nearly perfect design of the famous pyramids as we know them. And by the way, the chronology here is from earliest to latest, so you can see they just got better at it. Khufu's pyramid on the far right here took an estimated 20 years and 100,000 laborers to construct. And note, not slaves. That was the Hollywood version. These were not enslaved people. This was a work of public pride, of civic pride, in which masons and quarrymen and construction workers of all kind were brought in to work on the great accomplishment of their civilization, the Pharaoh's pyramid. Khufu's pyramid here is 480 feet high at its tip. It's something of an illusion here. It seems smaller than the middle pyramid, but that's just the optical effect. It's actually larger. It's 481 feet high and 760 feet along each side of the base, covering more than 13 acres of landscape and over 2.5 million blocks, quarried, cut, shaped blocks of limestone. So Egypt's most famous monument, revealed as part of this ecology of civilization, quarried from the materials in the earth, and with extraordinary ambition and effort and vision constructed as testaments to the civilization. To reshape the environment, human labor had to be mobilized, specialized, and utilized on a large scale, and that required, of course, centralized direction. And so what we saw in Mesopotamia, for example, was the need now of a kind of hierarchical structure of authority, a law-giving authority, a governing authority, an administrative authority, in terms of what we call now government. In Egypt, of course, it was the ancient Egyptians who devised the office known as Pharaoh, a divine king figure worshipped by the Egyptian people, seen as a father figure, but also a kind of divine figure. Pharaoh, for 2,000 years, was the central political figure in the evolving of Egyptian civilization. Here you see the depiction in stone, in polished stone, of Khafre, the 4th dynasty pharaoh. The political history of Egypt, ancient Egypt, is so long, beginning in the early 3000s and going down to the end of the Bronze Age in the year 1000. That is the central dynastic period of ancient Egyptian history, that scholars have to break it up into dynastic lines. So the 4th dynasty in this case meant the 4th family lineage of pharaohs to be placed on the Egyptian hierarchy. There were times when these dynasties would die out, there would be no available male heirs, or through some other conflict, a new family would arise. So, Khafre, the fourth dynasty pharaoh, for whom one of those great pyramids who we just saw, one of the great pyramids was built at the Giza Plateau. Pharaoh comes from the word Pharaoh, the Egyptian word Pharaoh, which meant great house. So it referred actually not so much to the person, but to the family dynasty, the great house, the home of the family. And ultimately, that home, of course, was signified by the building of a pyramid, at least for some of these pharaohs. It's thought the first pharaoh ruled Egypt around 3000 BCE. The idea of divinity, that is, that the pharaoh was a god king, probably evolved only over time. By the 2600s, in the third dynasty, it seems that pharaoh was being worshipped as a god. And a whole lineage, a whole sort of religious explanation, a religious lineage, saying that Pharaoh was the offspring of the god Ammon, the sun god, one of the more prominent, if not the most prominent, of the Egyptian deities. But the sun god Ammon was associated with the peoples of Upper Egypt, and so it also signals that a unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was happening by this period, as this southern god Ammon was now being incorporated into the pharaonic tradition of Lower Egypt. Power and authority of the pharaoh associated with the regular rhythms of the Nile River. People worshiped the pharaoh because the pharaoh, as a divine god king, ensured the regular rhythms of the Nile River, and he was the deliverer of an Egyptian concept known as Ma'at. Ma'at, which translates roughly as a kind of divine order and justice, a kind of wellness, if you will, of all things universal. In which the gods showed their deep care for the people of Egypt by providing them with that regular rhythmic flooding of the Nile that brought life and sustenance to the people. The pharaoh was also, in a more day-to-day sense, the governing authority which protected trade with other lands, that brought needed supplies to Egypt, that brought timber, for example, and ivory and gold and plants for perfumes and incense. I mean, one of the things we see in ancient Egypt is not just a kind of day-to-day concern, for the more practical things of this world, but also a kind of celebration of life, which meant aromatic perfumes and incense that would help, bring a kind of a pleasing aroma to one's life and labor and in many other ways, as we'll see from some of the images. Egyptian women, for example, took great care to preserve a kind of daily appearance, a daily beauty, complete with makeup and shampoo for the hair. So a celebration of the simple things in life, you might say, also ultimately part of the prerogative of the governing pharaoh, who, when times were good, these things were plentiful, and when times were bad, they were scarce. And it was usually during those times of scarcity then that the pharaohs could be displaced, or one dynasty be replaced by another. The origins of Egyptian kingship were probably more down to earth than a lot of the cosmic storytelling suggests. Scholars believe that the story of the first pharaoh, the first unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, is told on the small scale now of a cosmetics palette, that is, a piece of stone with relief carved into it, relief that shows the story perhaps of the first unification of Egypt on a scale of maybe less than 10 inches tall. This grinding palette, used in ordinary ways to make cosmetics, in this case more ceremonial, used to decorate and to signify perhaps the story of the first Egyptian pharaoh. It's called the Narmer palette by scholars, and you can see here that one side of it is shown in greater relief with the various symbols, each signifying some part of this story of unification. So just a quick look at it. For example, the central figure here is thought to be Narmer himself, that is, the figure who would come to be proclaimed the first pharaoh of Egypt. Not only is his stature greater than anyone else in the picture, but you'll notice he's holding a war club high above his own head. He has an unfortunate victim here, grabbed by the hair on his knees before the pharaoh, and it's anybody's guess as to whether that war club is going to bash the brains out of this unfortunate fellow. But regardless, this is a scene then of conquest, a scene of conquest over Lower Egypt, because the symbol here showing the boat with the reeds splayed out in a semi-triangular form, this was the symbol in Egypt for the Delta, the Lower Nile region. And so it seems to suggest, putting the pictures together, that he is conquering Lower Egypt. One of my favorite parts of the Narmer palette is this little character behind him, always careful to stay a certain discrete distance behind the pharaoh, and then you'll note here, carrying the sandals of the great man. So the sandal bearer of the pharaoh. And then each of the other images in their own way signifying both the authority and status of Narmer, but also his positioning now as the king of two lands. If you look over on the other side of the palette, he's shown here with the combined crown of both the Upper Egyptian crown but also the Lower Egyptian crown, the two crowns molded together. You see the sort of mythic beasts here with their necks entwined. That also seems to suggest something like unification. The Narmer palette then, yes, tells the story of how Egypt was first politically unified around 3000 BC as this man known as Narmer, a southern king whose name seems to have originally been Menes, who will be renamed Narmer now as the pharaoh who unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. It's thought that he was perhaps the first of these unified rulers to begin the work of irrigation, the building of levees, the protection against flood, and that sort of thing that would better harness these powerful forces of nature, which then again gets back to the ecology of civilization and the necessity of exploiting the environment. Ultimately, the power and authority of kings such as Narmer depended on a new system of government, but a new system of government that itself rested on a new technology for governing and law giving, a new technology of writing, for which Egypt is also famous. Here you see this lovely carved figure. He's not a king, he's not a pharaoh, he's not a stonemason, he is a scribe. His job was, as a highly skilled professional, to keep the records now of the Egyptian government, the Egyptian administration, which included everything from tax collecting to land assessment to engineering plans. The Egyptians highly revered the skill of writing. In fact, in their story, writing was bequeathed to mankind through the goddess of truth, who you see depicted here, the goddess of truth, and her husband Thoth, the god of writing. So Ma'at, the goddess of truth, and Thoth, the god of writing, combined to bequeath to the Egyptian people the ability to record information and to tell the story of their civilization. What we know as hieroglyphics now, a name, hieroglyph, a Greek name, again another Greek name that is bestowed on the Egyptian history. It simply meant in the original Greek sacred carving, hieroglyph. These were visual symbols, much more pictographic than the Mesopotamian cuneiform. You'll note actual familiar symbols like the eagle, the cobra, the owl, the viper, etc., that become themselves pictographic symbols of Egyptian concepts for everything from everyday objects to legal concepts, administrative concepts, a pictographic script that also encouraged an exchange of ideas across the generations and evolving viewpoints. 4,500 years ago, religious concepts of the afterlife in Egypt begin to show an evolving sense of morality in which gods interrogate the dead and weigh their good against their evil deeds, as suggested by the scales here in this picture. The heart of the deceased lies in one scale, while a feather symbolizing truth lies in the other. The examined soul must renounce its worldly sins. So long before the Judeo and later Christian traditions of a soul being weighed in the balance, the Egyptians in the 3rd millennium BCE are beginning to inject a kind of ethical and moral imperative into the daily life of faithful Egyptian people. Concerns about ethical behavior, in fact, morality, and even concepts of social justice are represented in a work known as The Plea of the Eloquent Peasant that dates back to about 1800 BCE, about the time of Hammurabi's Code in Mesopotamia was also laying the groundwork for a kind of moral order of lawful governing. The Plea of the Eloquent Peasant is an essay, though, written not by a king, not by Hammurabi, not by the pharaoh, but by an ordinary person, a peasant farmer, expressing his views of the good life, of ethical behavior, and reminding the government for fair treatment of the poor. So interesting concepts of social justice. Writing also encouraged the recording of knowledge, especially the knowledge of the natural world. One thing we don't often recognize about that ancient Egyptian tradition was its scientific and scholarly bent. Ancient Egyptian scholars developed mathematics, including a base 10 number system, an approximation of pi and square roots, as well as algebraic equations to solve for unknown integers. All of this thousands of years before such mathematical practices be common in the West. From the papyrus roll you see here, the geometrical calculations are evident. So from geometry to a kind of proto-algebra, a sophisticated system of mathematics, which is only to be expected for a people capable of such remarkable engineering feats as the Great Pyramids. Taking a quick look now here at a sister civilization, you might say, that of southern Asia. If the Nile's generous supply of water was necessary for Egypt's civilization, just as the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates were for Mesopotamia, then so too was a great river system critical to the rise of an ancient civilization in what is now modern-day Pakistan, fed by the springtime melting snow of the Himalayas and the summer monsoon rains of the Indian Ocean. The Indus Valley featured the Indus, Saraswati, and other river tributaries that provided plentiful irrigation for seasonal crops with twice-a-year flooding. In this little, I say little only on the map, discrete, well-bounded region of what is now, as I say, Pakistan, bordering the Indian Ocean, what scholars know as the Harappan civilization, which saw that seemingly miraculous relationship between the movement of annual floodwaters and river waters, the shifting of the seasons, the settling of the climates that allowed humans to wring from the soil the bread of life and the sustenance necessary for civilization itself. Coming off a broad floodplain does the Indus River, about roughly twice the size of Texas. So when I say little, again, I'm only looking at our map. It's actually quite a vast area. This floodplain that served to feed the Harappan civilization its needed waters and its fertile crops These rivers could change course, unlike the Nile, which found its groove, you could say, and stayed more or less consistent through time. The waters of the Indus River and the Saraswati could be rather unpredictable and move over time, which made the job of building permanent settlements a bit tricky, as some settlements could be abandoned in case the river waters would flood unpredictably. But like Egypt, the same net result of wheat and barley being the principal crops. Enough to bring an ecology of civilization to the Indus River Valley as early as 2800 BCE. Again, what we call the Harappan civilization was a series of city-states built on that great floodplain of the Indus and Saraswati rivers. Not unlike Sumer, where you see the rise of those city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates River plains. This map here shows, with each of the dots, basically sites, the little triangles, little dots, sites of ancient settlement that have been excavated or partially excavated in our own time. Crops and cattle too, the domestication of cattle, as we saw in the other civilizations of the Nile and Tigris and Euphrates. The cattle provided basic nutrition, the domesticated animals provided basic nutrition, and milk and meat, and even leather for the urban settlements throughout the valley. One of the really kind of cool artifacts of the Harappan, not to be confused with the enormous pyramids of Egypt, the tiny, so tiny they could hold several in your hand like coins, are the little clay seals that were signifying usually trade goods, a kind of proto-currency, if you will, but intricately carved. You see here the bull, a rather elaborate bull, as well, carved on a piece of clay no bigger than, say, a quarter or maybe $50. You see a different view of the Indus River plain, with the mountains towering in the background, the river making its way across the broad plains. This was the landscape of the Harappan. A valley dotted with urban settlements that showed signs of sophisticated city planning, drainage and sewage systems that kept the cities well irrigated and clean, like Sumer, using clay-baked bricks in most of their construction, making use of the materials at hand. In other words, it's known that in many of these city-states, a standard brick size have been established and used throughout the city as a kind of building code, you might say, in the settlements of the Harappan civilization. This took urban planning, this took administration, any kind of uniform weights and measures or standardized sizes of bricks, for example, required a high degree of sophistication. Along with a system of standardized weights and measures. The streets were laid out in a grid design at right angles, again making use of the geometry of urban planning. And what's left, even today, is remarkable and in its own way breathtaking. Urban culture characterized by commerce, government, religion, and art, with populations sometimes approaching 40,000 in a city-state. Here you see one of the clay seals again, the intricately carved, what appears to be a kind of pictographic letter script, the familiar image of the bull, all of this signifying again the essential cultural iconography of the Harappan people, like little artistic masterpieces. These seal stones were used to mark trade goods and point to the development of a kind of proto-written language featuring symbols and other characters. So yes, the Harappan, Southeast Asia's first great civilization. I love the little figurine here, probably a priest figure, a sculpted figure found in one of the great Harappan sites known as Mohenjo-Daro, the largest, what's thought to be the largest of the Harappan cities, suggesting a kind of class stratification, a professional class, a priest class of people in this case. Undoubtedly there were others, governors, scribes, Someone had to make those clay symbols. Workers, brick masons, you name it. The stratification and specialization of classes and crafts. Southeast Asia's oldest civilization, it seems, was undone by its environmental impact. It appears that most sites, most of the cities were abandoned by around 1700 BC. Now, this would normally be the cause for speculation and mysterious and exotic answers as to what happened to this vanished civilization. Well, actually, it's much more, how should I say, practical, and the reasons for a civilization's decline have less to do with the mysteries and exotic answers popular on certain TV shows or books, and more to do with the environment. You start with an ecology of civilization, you end with an ecology of civilization. So just quickly to consider the ecological consequences of civilization: the loss of soil fertility due to overplanting and salinization, deforestation, and soil erosion from the cutting of timbers used in the building projects. It's thought that an enormous amount of lumber was needed, for example, just to fire the kilns in which the great bricks, the clay bricks, were baked. Over time, the loss of forests, the loss of lumber, the loss of soil and soil fertility. Look, it left people little option but to abandon these sites and to move elsewhere. But the job of trying to recreate, of course, would be left to future generations. And so where do we end? The Harappan leaders by the 18th century BCE sought to keep civilization strong through constant expansion, and eventually over 500,000 square miles of expansion marked the Harappans until the capacity of the earth was simply exhausted. Its ability to replenish itself was exhausted, and the largest of the ancient civilizations came as a result to an end. So we see civilizations rise, we see civilizations fall. It's the story of civilization itself, and it's a story that, of course, we will continue as we move forward into the semester. But for now, this being the end of part 3 of our first civilizations lecture.